These acts are a nullity, and we declare them void. That's how Thomas Jefferson described a long and detailed list of grievances with the British 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. On this episode, I'm going to go through the highlights of Thomas Jefferson's almost totally forgotten and ignored 1774 pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America, where he not only took the position that Parliament had no right whatsoever to exercise any authority over us, but he also included a laundry list going back more than a century of British laws, both internal and external, that he saw as unconstitutional and void. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, September 6th, 2024. But of course, we are going back in history all the way to September 5th, 1774, when delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met at a place called Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia for the start of what we call today the First Continental Congress. But even before that, back in July of 74, Jefferson started writing this pamphlet with a goal of persuading the Virginia delegation to take a really strong stand, a strong posture towards Great Britain, and that is now called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. We don't know if he gave it that title or someone else, from my understanding. Now, here from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, they point out that he pretty much got the job writing the Declaration because he essentially had already written the Declaration in his 1774 Summary View, a landmark in Virginia history. It really is a landmark in American history, in my view. He included in it a strong attack on the king, a rejection of Parliament having any authority over the colonies at all. A lot of people, of course, at the time thought the British could have power over external trade, and Jefferson said, nothing, you have no authority at all. He had a condemnation of slavery and the international slave trade, and included a power of the people of the colonies to declare British acts both a nullity and void. Mike Meharry points out that in many ways, a summary view was a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. Many of what Jefferson called unwarrantable encroachments and usurpations, you'll see very similar language like this in the Declaration, Jefferson outlined there reappear in the Declaration. But let's get right to this. Here's the first sentence. It was a quote from one of Jefferson's favorite Roman writers, Cicero. And it was aimed, you can tell, directly at the king rather than Parliament, but there's plenty for Parliament too. And he wrote, "It is the indispensable duty of the supreme magistrate to consider himself as acting for the whole community and obliged to support its dignity and assign to the people with justice their various rights, as he would be faithful to the great trust reposed in him." And he continued with this, and this is, he is no more than the chief officer of the people. He's taking the position that government at any level, even a king, is merely an agent of the people. He is no more than the chief officer of the people, appointed by the laws and circumscribed with definite powers. Even the king, according to Jefferson, would have limits on his power. And it was there to assist in working the great machine of government, erected for the use of the people, for their use, and consequently subject to their superintendence. Now, if you think about it, Jefferson here is really describing what would eventually become the model for the president, for the executive branch, and the entire system under the Constitution for the United States some years later. That is, the people are sovereign. They hold final authority. All power flows from the people of the several states, and government at every level, no matter what their title may be, they're merely the agent of the people. Now, of course, the British wouldn't agree with that. They probably thought it was ludicrous to even suggest such a thing. But Jefferson pushed on anyways, and he based much of his position, his philosophical take, on natural rights, natural law, including a right to local self-government. And he said, our ancestors, before their emigration to America, were the free inhabitants of the British dominions in Europe and possessed a right which nature has given to all men, departing from the country in which chance, not choice, had placed them, of going in quest of new habitations, and of there establishing new societies, under such laws and regulations as to them shall seem most likely to promote public happiness. Very similar precursor to the Declaration there as well. He continued with this, that settlements having been thus effected in the wilds of America, the emigrants thought proper to adopt the system of laws under which they had hitherto lived in the mother country, and to continue their union with her by submitting themselves to the same common sovereign, who was thereby made the central link connecting the several parts of the empire thus newly multiplied. That's Jeffersonian flair to basically say none of this was by right of the British government, Parliament, or the king. The people had a natural right to leave where they happened to be born and to find a new place to live. John Locke, of course, talked about people were free to leave whatever society they were born in and go to a state of nature, for example. And certainly that's what the people did when they went to America. And then they have a free choice to decide what kind of laws they're going to set up in that area. Now, the people happen to, as Jefferson point out, voluntarily chose to go along with much of the system of the British. Not exactly the same, but they chose many of the same laws. And then they also made the free choice to stay in union. They chose in union to submit themselves to this common sovereign. So this was all of free will. Harry points out that he went on to insist that the colonies were erected into distinct and independent governments. As such, Mike writes, they retained most powers, while the mother country was limited to exercising only a few specific functions. This idea was, again, carried over to the U.S. constitutional system, with the states, the people of the states, maintaining sovereignty with a general government delegated only a few specific powers. So Jefferson, really a precursor to the Constitution as well. Now, having established this foundational principle, these base principles based on natural rights, and on choice to be separate, but still connected in a union. The colonies were essentially, in his view, sovereign states. They were attached to the British Empire only through the crown, and it was very limited. So then Jefferson started to outline some of the most prominent encroachments and usurpations that both the Parliament and the crown had committed, and they went back way back. We're not talking just the Stamp Act, but a century before that as well. And Mike points out that many of the colonial grievances were economic. Of course, we've heard the phrase taxation without representation, but that was just an example of so many of the other things that were going on. He said this stemmed from the fundamental economic system embraced by the empire, mercantilism, a system that used state power in an attempt to accumulate wealth for the nation and its favorite businesses. Now, a lot of people, again, they look to the Stamp Act as the beginning of arbitrary power, and I've done that many times over the years as well, but I've learned also over the years as well that people like Jefferson and others recognize that there was a problem much earlier. Madison at one point had written, James Madison had written at one point, like, look, okay, we always thought all of this stuff was unconstitutional. We let it go because it didn't seem so bad. But it was unconstitutional from day one. And so Jefferson went all the way back to the mid-17th century, where he attacked British laws and regulations on trade, both internal and external. And he really went after this mercantilist notion that the British could have protectionist policies by talking about the right of free trade, natural right of free trade. He said the exercise of a free trade with all parts of the world possessed by the American colonists as of natural right, and of which no law of their own had taken away or abridged, was the next object of unjust encroachment. In other words, this is another one of these things that we make the decision on ourselves. You have no say over this whatsoever. If we want to restrict our own trade and be dumb, that might be up to us, but, well, anyways, he even referenced a treaty that Virginia made, I think it's 1651, to guarantee free trade. He said, by solemn treaty, entered into on the 12th day of March, there it is, 1651, between the said Commonwealth by their commissioners and the colony of Virginia by their House of Burgesses, it was expressly stipulated by the 8th article of the said treaty that they should have, quote, free trade as the people of England do enjoy to all places and with all nations according to the laws of that Commonwealth. So saying like, look, This is what our expectations are. We've even signed a deal with you to make it so, and you violated this all along. He went back to 1651. Meharry points out that Jefferson then, in his list of grievances, he cited specific acts in the years. He said Jefferson referenced several acts, including the Destruction of Trees Act of 1663, that regulated, really prohibited in many situations, the cutting down of trees. How difficult would that be for a lot of people? The act was intended, of course, it's a protectionist policy to protect British shipbuilding resources. So if the Americans could supply a lot more lumber, then at a cheaper cost, then that might impact some businesses that were already favored back home in the mother country. He also implicated the Trade Act of 1672 and the Navigation Act of 1673, which were part of a broader bundle of laws generally referred to as the Navigation Acts. Imposed, Mike writes, between 1651 and 1696. So Jefferson's going through this. It's not like he was just new to understanding the history of the American colonies, and he's going through this in detail, this list of acts. These laws restricted colonial trade by generally requiring that goods imported to or exported from the colonies must be transported on British ships. We have a similar act like that today, called the Jones Act. Now, I covered many more of these mercantilist acts going all the way back to 1651 in much more detail in an episode, Mercantilism Before the Tea Party, Forgotten Grievance of the Revolution. That's going to be linked to in the show notes over at 10thAmendmentCenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. Alan Mosley will get the blog post organized for this episode, where we include not only all the different platforms we're on, both video and audio-only podcast editions, but there's also, if you scroll down a little bit for each blog post, there's a show links section. So I'm going through this pretty quickly. I'm just giving you highlights to kind of whet your appetite in case you want to read and learn more in context on your own time. And you will be able to find that all kind of in order as I go through it in the show, and you can follow along. Again, 10thAmendmentCenter.com/path to liberty. I'll get that published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. Anyways, back to Jefferson. He continued with this. The trade of the colonies. So I'm going to give some highlights of some of these mercantilist acts that he's talking about. He said the trade of the colonies was laid under such restrictions as show what hopes they might form from the justice of a British Parliament were its uncontrolled power admitted over these states. So he's looking to the history. What have they done? And let's look at that as an example of how will they use this precedent against us. And, in other words, he said the acts of Parliament were not just encroachments. He considered them prophetic. They were a taste of how things were going to end up if the British were allowed to build on the precedents they had already established, especially with external trade, but what they were already doing internally as well. He expected total and complete control. And he continued with this. History has informed us that bodies of men, as well as individuals, are susceptible of the spirit of tyranny. And that should be super obvious. But he said a view of these acts of Parliament for regulation, as it has been affectedly called, of the American trade, if all other evidence were removed out of the case, would undeniably evince the truth of this observation. So, look, they call it regulation. They're going to make it regular. We're just going to regulate these bad guys. We're going to make everything equal for everybody. These are the types of phrases we hear today. They've been using terms like this for centuries. And Jefferson called him out on this. He's like, okay, you want to call it that? But really what it is showing us that these people are susceptible of the spirit of tyranny. Anyways, he then went on to give a number of specific examples. I covered some of those in that Mercantilist article in more detail than I will here. But one of them was the Iron Act of 1750. Not something I ever was taught in government-run school. Probably not anybody here, but once in a while you find somebody. But that act prohibited the production of iron in the colonies. Again, it was protecting domestic businesses. And so they were trying to keep the people down over here so they could make more money over there. And Jefferson was no fan of that, of course. He said, the iron which we make, we are forbidden to manufacture. And heavy as that article is, and necessary in every branch of husbandry, besides commission and insurance, we are to pay freight for it to Great Britain, and freight for it back again for the purpose of supporting not men, but machines in the island of Great Britain. The absurdity of this, like, we're not allowed, we can produce raw materials here, but we can't actually manufacture stuff with iron or into iron, I guess. I'm not really sure about the manufacturing end of things, but he's basically saying in order for us to use this, we first have to ship it all the way there, let them do it, they earn the money, they get the jobs, it comes back here, we got to pay way more for it, and then we can finally use it. This is absurd. Here's another one that no one talks about. Well, it's beyond absurd. It really is an act of tyranny. Another one no one talks about is the Hat Act of 1732. It sounds kind of innocuous, a Hat Act, but he points out that by an act passed in the 5th year of the reign of His late Majesty King George II, an American subject is forbidden to make a hat for himself of the fur which he has taken perhaps on his own soil. There was a restriction on production of hats and some other articles of clothing, and even if you took the animal on your own property, you were not allowed to make it into something else. It had to be from a British business, and you couldn't do this locally. He said, an instance of despotism to which no parallel can be produced in the most arbitrary ages of British history. Today, if someone did that, a lot of people would probably be opposed to it. But certainly you'd get responses like, okay, yeah, I mean, this isn't going to end my life. This isn't going to be the worst thing on earth. But Jefferson understood the precedent. If they can control what you can make on your own property from the fruits of your own labor in your own home, they have unlimited power. He considered it an instance of despotism to which no parallel can be produced. Man, the Hat Act of 1732. We got to talk about that one a little bit more. Then he used the same principles that he would later cite in the Kentucky resolutions of 1798 against the hated Alien and Sedition Acts, where he said a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy when they go beyond the limits of the Constitution. So he pronounced all these British acts, these acts of regulation and commercial trade from 1651 through the Iron Act of 1750. We'll get to more after that as well. He pronounced them all a nullity and void. And he put it like this: we do not point out to His Majesty the injustice of these acts with the intent to rest on that principle the cause of their nullity, but to show that experience confirms the propriety of those political principles which exempt us from the jurisdiction of the British Parliament. The true ground on which we declare these acts void is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us. Man, there's so much to unpack there, but the TLDR, the British have no power whatsoever. The Parliament has no power over the colonies. Their trade, their laws, internal, external, nothing. Far more radical than what most people would think went down in the American Revolution, where they were just concerned about internal taxes, or they wanted representatives in order to have taxes. He's saying Parliament has no authority whatsoever. And then on top of it, we are declaring it void. Now, of course, they're asking for them to get rid of them, but we are declaring them void. And of course, we know that smuggling and other things were making them void in practice and effect. Well, from there, Mike Meharry points out that Jefferson was making the case that it wasn't so much the negative impact of these acts that made them problematic. And a lot of people focus on that. They focus on, well, do I like the end result of this? Do I dislike the end result? And that's all they care about. They don't think about the constitutional issue, the precedent, which really is the underlying foundation of all of it. Because if you can give government the power to do something just because some people like it, you're always going to find some other people who like any type of power that government exercises. That's not what makes for a good reason for government to do stuff. They're only authorized to do stuff that they're authorized to do. Anything beyond that is a nullity that we need to declare void. So Jefferson wasn't pointing out that it was the negative impact, although he went through that in some detail. He was asserting a more fundamental principle. Whether good or bad, Mike writes, these acts were null and void simply because they crossed a line in the sand and usurped power that rightly belonged to the people of the colonies. And then Jefferson went on to point out that these exercises of usurped power, usurpation, is an exercise of power not authorized to government. It's a theft of power from the sovereign people. the people where power all flows from, if they say you can only do this, this, and this, and then they add another thing to it, that is stealing power that rightly belongs with the people. So usurpation of power, what St. George Tucker later called treason against the sovereignty of the people. Jefferson was a big fan of Tucker's work as well. He said these were not confined to the economic acts already listed, but, quote, they have also intermeddled with the regulations of the internal affairs of the colony. So first, he says, all this external stuff, of course, a lot of people may have been okay with it just as long as you stick with that, but don't mess with us in here. But he pointed out, like, look, all you have to do is look at what they're doing and they're going to make it worse. And now we see that they have certainly tried to do much worse things on internal regulation. And then he cited a bunch of acts that most of us are usually more familiar with. There's the Sugar Act, that's 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Declaratory Act, which they passed as a slap in the face. Benjamin Franklin was originally okay with it and then realized it was a big problem. A slap in the face as they repealed the Stamp Act due to the nullification and popular resistance to it. The Declaratory Act, which claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Unlimited power in every single situation. He then went on to take a very direct and particular aim at the Townshend Acts and the Coercive Acts. And he specifically here talked about the New York Restraining Act, which dissolved the legislature of New York. John Dickinson, his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, also took direct aim at this one as well. But he points out, here's how Jefferson put it, but that one other act, passed in the same 7th year of the reign, having been a peculiar attempt, must ever require peculiar mention. It is entitled An Act for Suspending the Legislature of New York. This is another act of massive despotism to Thomas Jefferson. He said, one free and independent legislature hereby takes upon itself to suspend the powers of another, free and independent as itself, thus exhibiting a phenomenon unknown in nature, the creator and creature of its own power. And you see this again in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. He said, if the government gets to determine the limit of its own power, there is no limits to its power. You're basically left to their goodwill, and that's not really a good thing at all. He said not only the principles of common sense, but the common feelings of human nature must be surrendered up before His Majesty's subjects here can be persuaded to believe that they hold their political existence at the will of a British Parliament. That was about the New York Restraining Act. But then he asked the essential questions. Well, who the heck are these people and what gives them the right to rule over us in the first place? How can they suspend our ability to conduct the things the way we want to locally? And they did it through violence and force. Anyways, he said, without attempting a distinction between the guilty and the innocent. He's talking about the issues of the Boston Port Act as well, which was kind of a collective punishment, really, for the Tea Party in 1773. And he points out, like, they're not separating, they're punishing, they're shutting down the entire port, they're stopping trade. And he's saying you're not actually going, even if you were saying that those few people who threw the tea into the harbor needed to be punished, what you're doing is you're punishing everybody. He said not the 100th part of the inhabitants of that town had been concerned in the act complained of. Many of them were in Great Britain and in other parts beyond sea. Yet all were involved in one indiscriminate ruin by a new executive power unheard of till then, that of a British Parliament. So the Parliament then gets to shut down the entire port and punish everybody specifically until restitution is made to the tea company. And this is, again, collective punishment. It is not treating people as individuals. He said a property of the value of many millions of money was sacrificed to revenge, not repay the loss of a few thousands. This is administering justice with a heavy hand. Indeed, this was collective punishment, something we see a lot of that over and over and over. Now, he said these are acts of power assumed by a body of men foreign to our constitutions. This is that question of who are these people? Why do they have a right to have any say over what we do. We don't know them. We've never interacted with them. We don't choose them. We have no influence upon them. These are just far-off tyrants. These are the acts of power assumed by a body of men, foreign to our constitutions and unacknowledged by our laws, against which we do, on behalf of the inhabitants of British America, enter this our solemn and determined protest. And we do earnestly entreat His Majesty, as yet the only mediatory power between the several states of the British Empire, to recommend to his Parliament of Great Britain, what's that? A total revocation of these acts, which, however nugatory they may be, may yet prove the cause of further discontents and jealousy among us. So he made this demand. Basically, we are going to say, you can't do any of this. You got to get rid of it. He didn't ask for things to be less bad or more efficient or lighter regulation or more equality. That's just tinkering around the edges. He wanted a total repeal, and that was the only thing that was seen as acceptable. Now, James Madison later referred to this kind of position, he didn't cite Jefferson specifically, in his report of 1800 as part of the fundamental principle on which independence itself was declared. That is, the British had a limit to their power. When they go beyond that power, those acts are void. And it's up to the people to take a stand for their rights, no matter what the other governments happen to say about it. And here's how Madison put it. The assertion by Great Britain of a power to make laws for the other members of the empire in all cases whatsoever ended in the discovery that she had a right to make laws for them in no cases whatsoever. I covered that in much more detail in another episode just last month, The Ignored Fundamental Principle of the American Revolution. Alan will get that included in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. We got a bit more here. Here's from Meharry. We got to go to the king. He said, while Parliament's unconstitutional, null and void acts drew the lion's share of Jefferson's ire. A lot of people, when you read about this, they'll talk about how they focused on the king most, but he didn't get to the king till really, he started with it, but he went through this laundry list of acts of Parliament, and then he finally gets to the king again. He said he also took on the king's deviations from the line of duty. And Mike says that Jefferson saw the king going outside long-standing tradition and custom in his wanton exercise of power. And even where maybe the king had the right to do stuff, he was going against a long type of tradition and doing things that no one really expected or wanted, no one approved of. They had lived in much different ways for a long time. And Mike says that Jefferson enumerated several actions by the crown that were seriously problematic. Of course, dissolving colonial legislatures and refusing to call them into session. 2, making civil government subject to the military. 3, sending large bodies of armed forces to the colonies, standing armies issues, of course. Asserting what Jefferson called the fictitious principle that all lands belong originally to the king. Property rights here. The British were claiming the power to use American lands to cover debts for people that didn't take on the debts. So they were basically saying, well, those are the king's lands, and you're just going to have to pay extra for this if you want to stay there. And then also refusing to allow counties in Virginia specifically to split without meeting certain requirements. And so he had a kind of a pretty long list of stuff there, but he also had an issue with slavery as well. And he writes, the abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies, where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But, he said, we need to do something. We're trying to get rid of it, and you're blocking us from actually making that happen. He said, previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibitions and by imposing duties which might amount to a prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative. Man, there's a lot there. First of all, I want to point out, I was just thinking this as I'm reading through it again. Duties amount to a prohibition. If you tax stuff enough, if you make it really expensive, it's no different than saying you're not allowed to buy or sell this stuff in practice because that's how it plays out, because it's too expensive. But he's also pointing out that, the first step we're trying to make, because our ultimate goal is to get rid of slavery, is to stop the international slave trade. Of course, George Mason found the fact that they were going to let the international slave trade continue until 1808 to be kind of the turning point at the Philadelphia Convention, the deal that allowed that where he said, oh no, I am definitely not on board with what you guys are proposing here. Thomas Jefferson was long against this as well, and he was the guy, the first day he had a chance in 1808, he was the guy who signed the ban on the international slave trade while he was president in office. So this is something he worked for many years, despite whatever was going on in his personal life, but he certainly pushed for it and then made it happen. But he said, look, we were trying to make this happen before 1774, and the king used his royal negative, his veto power, to say we're not allowed to do that. And this is how Jefferson described it. That this is so shameful an abuse of power trusted with his majesty for other purposes, as if not reformed, would call for some legal restrictions. So Jefferson on slavery there as well. And Mike Meharry points out that he concluded his list of grievances against the crown with an emphatic smackdown of royal authority, boldly asserting that the colonists were laying their grievances before his majesty with that freedom of language and sentiment, which becomes a free people claiming their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. He's telling them, look, we're going to you. We're asking you to do the right thing, but ultimately we claim our rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift from you or anybody else. So he goes on with this. Let those flatter who fear. Now, we're not going to kiss your butt on this, but, we'll be courteous, but ultimately the decision is ours. He said, let those flatter who fear. It is not an American art. To give praise which is not due might be well from the venal, but would ill beseem those who are asserting the rights of human nature. You can't assert your natural rights if you're begging for them. You aren't pleading for them. You assert your rights as coming from the laws of nature, from your creator, from your God, no matter what. It doesn't matter what government has to say. And that's how Jefferson is putting it. He said, they know and will therefore say that kings are the servants and not the proprietors of the people. So ultimately, he's reiterating the view that government is an agent of the people and nothing more, even kings. Now, although I have seen some historians who've written about this say that Jefferson really, underneath it all, he really believed that the colonies should have been declaring independence right there in 1774. Maybe that's the case. I'm not a Jeffersonian expert on this type of stuff, but he closed out this document saying, independence, breaking away is not our goal. And maybe that was just trying to smooth stuff over because he used some pretty harsh language here. But he said, it is neither our wish nor our interest to separate from her. We are willing on our part to sacrifice everything which reason can ask to the restoration of that tranquility for which all must wish. So he's saying, look, these are the problems. Let's fix this. He even said, hey, king, this is my paraphrase, you have an opportunity to go down in history as the good guy, as someone who's seen as a hero, in essence, not someone who is ruining the prosperity of so many people. He said, on their part, let them be ready to establish union and a generous plan. Let them name their terms, but let them be just. Accept of every commercial preference. Again, he's talking about free trade. You got to let go of all this regulation, this taxation, this control, these prohibitions. They all have to go, or else it's not a good thing. Except of every commercial preference, it is in our power to give for such things as we can raise for their use, or they make for ours. But let them not think to exclude us from going to other markets to dispose of those commodities which they cannot use, or to supply those wants which they cannot supply. In other words, if you can't buy our stuff, we're going to sell it to somebody else, whether you want to produce it in your country or not. If you can't use our stuff, we want to be able to conduct trade with other people. We want to be able to do that. We can give a preference to you because we can make deals, but you can't cut us off if we have more to give, more to sell. He said, still less let it be proposed that our properties within our own territories shall be taxed or regulated by any power on earth but our own. So the ultimate end goal for Jefferson is that the British had zero power in any way, no taxes, 0%, flat tax, that's the perfect one, and zero regulations, not tens of thousands of them like we have today. He said, the God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy, but cannot disjoin them. This, sire, is our determined resolution. Look, I don't know about you, but I never heard a single word about this document when I went to government-run schools back in the 80s in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I didn't hear about it in college whatsoever. And I'm pretty confident they're not teaching really anybody about it today. If they do, maybe they mention it as a line, show a few highlights, but they're definitely not talking about calling acts of government a nullity or the power of the people to declare them void or limits of power or sovereignty. And that's why we work so hard every single day to get this kind of essential, historical, and foundational information and principles out to more and more people. And absolutely nothing helps us roll up our sleeves every single day and get the job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you support the work that we're doing, please consider joining us as a member today. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. You got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat. Please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have a bunch of other options, annual, 5-year, lifetime options. You can make a one-time donation at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Use all kinds of different payment methods, etc. But you'll, again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. And that's more important than anything. Again, a reminder, I'm going to be off all next week. That's the week of the 9th of September. Because I'm in the middle of a move and I just need the time to get that done properly and reset my studio in the new place. But hopefully that'll be all ready to go by the 16th, if I'm getting my dates correct. I'll be back to my regular schedule of Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at that point. But just a quick reminder, I hope you have an awesome week. We'll try to get a couple of shorts and a few other things posted in the meantime. Make sure to follow us on all our platforms. And of course, our newsletter, 10thamendmentcenter.com/newsletter, probably something like that. Anyways, I appreciate you being here. Hope you have an awesome weekend. And I look forward to seeing you next time here on the path to liberty.